Hurricane Katrina was one of the deadliest natural disasters to hit the United States. Around 1,800 people died, and around $100 billion in damage was caused from excessive flooding and extreme winds. But did it have to be this way? The failure of the federal government exacerbated this. The failures of Congress, the Bush administration, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also called FEMA, and the Army Corps of Engineers performed poorly to a disaster they believed was probable decades in advance. The failures of Katrina highlight the insane bureaucracy and red tape that has overtaken the US government, and showed even possible malice from the feds. Hurricane Katrina was a Category 3 hurricane that made landfall on August 29, 2005, and had wind speeds up to 174 miles per hour. But the most dangerous aspect of Katrina were the storm surges and flooding. Surges 27 feet tall penetrated 6 to 12 miles inland, drowning and dragging people away. 80% of New Orleans was underwater. People for decades knew something like this would happen. 40 years before Katrina, in 1965, Congress commissioned the Army Corps of Engineers to construct a levee to protect Louisiana. But it had a few problems. First of all, the project wasn't going to be completed until 2015, so 10 years too late. But that was just one problem. The project was given $738 million, which apparently wasn't enough, and they cut corners. The engineers built the levees on areas with weak sand instead of firm clay. Some areas were only built 10 feet high when they were supposed to be 17 feet high, and steel pilings were way too shallow. The levee, of course, failed and the flooding began. If these levees were built properly, it is estimated that about 2/3 of the flooding would have been prevented. When the waters rose, people had to stay in their attics. And when water rose to the attics, they had to go to the roofs. But if they had no exits in their attic, they drowned. Katrina is abounding with horror stories of people hearing their neighbors banging and screaming in their attic coffins until they finally go silent. But was the levee failure just caused by bad engineering? There are many claiming that it goes beyond pure incompetence and laziness. People like Louis Farrakhan accused the government of intentionally blowing up certain parts of the levee to divert water from rich neighborhoods so the water flowed into poorer ones. The claim was taken to the House of Representatives, who were investigating Katrina at the time, but they said it was just a myth. We'll probably never know the truth. But this is just the beginning of the federal government's incompetence and malice. The threat of a Katrina-like hurricane was known for a while. That's why they had that piss fart of a levee built. But they didn't just build the levee and call it a day. The feds had drills for rescue operations and supply logistics made for this exact situation. Literally a year before Katrina hit, they had a simulation exercise for a storm of similar strength that was called Hurricane Pam. And the weather goblins knew Katrina's path 6 days in advance. So you think supplies and rescue logistics would be in place, but preparation was slow and unorganized. FEMA, a federal branch that was created just for disaster response, was a complete mess. The 2006 bipartisan House report on Katrina said that there was a general confusion over mission assignments, deployments, and command structure. And because many of FEMA's executive positions were filled by people who only got there through political means, they had poor leaders with little experience with disaster response. The report also said there was a complete breakdown in communications that paralyzed command and control and made situational awareness murky at best. There were tons of equipment failures, and the systems they had in place became inoperable. In 2005, FEMA's budget was $67 billion, which is $110 billion today because inflation. Not all of it went towards Katrina. President George Bush signed a $10.5 billion relief bill for Katrina specifically. The $67 billion was split between many disasters. 2005 was a bad year for natural disasters. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, Hurricane Dennis, wildfires in California. Well, California wildfires are pretty normal. Half of California burns down every year, so I'm sure that's already accounted for in the yearly budget. But that, on top of all these other disasters, showed us that Mother Nature was pissed at us for some reason. Maybe that's the year she discovered microplastics in her piss. But because of all these disasters, FEMA was given a lot more money than usual. Money that they squandered and mismanaged. FEMA's massive monetary waste became legendary. FEMA spent $1.3 billion on mobile homes for people who had no place to stay, but they were mostly unused. Due to their own dumbass regulations, mobile homes weren't allowed in floodplains, which is where most people affected by Katrina lived. And the homes that were used made people sick, due to them being filled with the carcinogenic formaldehyde. FEMA also did the weird move of shipping millions of pounds of ice to cities that weren't even affected by Katrina. So truckers went on bizarre trips to random cities, giving them truckloads of ice, going as far as northern Maine. And after the storm was over, they destroyed $100 million worth of ice. The feds did more than waste money on ice and unused mobile homes. They were also involved in one of the biggest cases of fraud in American history. Among the many superlatives associated with Hurricane Katrina can now be added this one. It produced one of the most extraordinary displays of scams, schemes, and stupefying bureaucratic bungles in modern history, costing taxpayers up to $2 billion. Tons of fake victims of Katrina getting thousands of dollars. An Associated Press analysis estimates as many as 162,000 homes did not exist before the storm and received around $1 billion in tax money. In 2008, the Hurricane Katrina Fraud Task Force brought charges against 907 people. 100% that was only a small fraction of the people who stole taxpayer money because of the government's terrible background checking and just giving money to anyone who asked for it. Luckily, all this money wasted was counteracted by aid from foreign countries. Just kidding. For some reason, they denied almost all of it. Of the $854 million offered in cash and oil, the government only accepted $40 million of it. They denied 54 of the 77 aid offers from Canada, Britain, and Israel. 10,000 pages of documents were released about this under the Freedom of Information Act of 2006. One of the documents showed that one of the few times they accepted foreign aid, they wasted it. Medical supplies that were received from Italy spoiled since they were left outside and got ruined. A lot of this can be chalked up to horrible incompetence. Well, some of it. But eventually, it gets hard to tell whether the feds were just bad at their jobs or just straight up held malice towards the victims of Katrina. I say this because they made incredibly confusing and jaw-dropping decisions by denying aid and making Katrina a nightmare for volunteers. FEMA and other agencies gave out a lot of supplies before Katrina hit, but not nearly enough. FEMA, of course, was incredibly slow and inefficient when it came to dropping in supplies. The Superdome and many other shelters were critically low on everything: food, water, medical supplies, etc. But other groups that actually could bring in fresh supplies efficiently were straight up turned away. Over a dozen Walmart tractor trailers of supplies were forced to turn around. FEMA repeatedly blocked and confiscated emergency supplies issued by the Methodist Hospital of New Orleans, doctors being turned away since their names weren't in official government databases, and the Red Cross being denied into the Superdome to deliver fresh supplies, and hundreds of other confusing and totally backwards decisions made by FEMA. Many thousands of people volunteered to try and help with the rescue and cleanup, but they had to go around an incomprehensible labyrinth of red tape to be allowed to assist. Firefighters, EMS, and police officers outside of Katrina's AoE attack were only allowed to help after they were forced to spend 2 days on training classes in Atlanta, where they were taught the ever so valuable information about the history of FEMA and had to go through sexual harassment courses. What? Did they think all the outside emergency responders used to work for Blizzard or something? These guys were already trained first responders. Why waste all this time? FEMA also refused Amtrak's offer to evacuate citizens, so their helicopters sat idle on the roof. And FEMA ignored calls from the American Bus and Motor Coach Associations, so they weren't allowed to assist people either. There were massive fires caused by Katrina, and the US Forest Service offered their water tanker aircraft to help with the fires. But of course, FEMA said no. They even intentionally sabotaged other groups. They cut the Jefferson Parish emergency communication line, but the sheriff was able to restore it. But he had to set up a post of armed guards to protect it from FEMA. There are also stories of regular dudes in their private boats trying to rescue people, but being turned back because they weren't authorized to be there. At first, people were pissed that the Red Cross, which is usually the first to show up at any disaster, wasn't in New Orleans. But later, we find out they were intentionally stopped by the State National Guard and the Department of Homeland Security. The Red Cross was in constant contact with the authorities, but they were just simply barred from entering the city. The reason they were given was that their presence would keep people from evacuating, and it would encourage people to come back to the city. Many hundreds of deaths could have been prevented, but the insane bureaucracy of the feds prevented any efficient response. Might as well throw this in here, but the police were also incredibly disorganized. Cops shooting and threatening looters. To be fair though, a lot of New Orleans residents used Katrina as an excuse to steal luxury items, but since food and water were so low, many of the looters were legitimately in a life and death situation. There's a story of a cop burning a man alive in his car, and cops using this as an opportunity to seize all guns from civilians, whether they own them legally or not. I don't want to shit on the state too much, and I want to end this on a positive note. Some government agencies performed pretty well. The Coast Guard was quite efficient. They deployed 4,000 service members, 37 aircraft, and 78 boats, and rescued 30,000 people following Katrina. It's said the reason they performed well was because the Coast Guard wasn't nearly as bureaucratic as FEMA and other federal agencies. And despite the bizarre blocking of the Red Cross from New Orleans, the National Guard was considered invaluable by Louisiana and Mississippi officials. The private sector was also very helpful. The Red Cross shelters held 146,000 evacuees and served 52 million meals to survivors. And the Salvation Army helped 30,000 evacuees. And even for-profit businesses helped a lot too. Walmart delivered 1,500 truckloads of merchandise, they donated $17 million, and gave out 100,000 meals. Even Home Depot donated millions of dollars of supplies. Katrina showed us the unfathomable bundle of bureaucracy that plagues our institutions, and even possible malice that the state holds for its citizens. President Bush, FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers didn't know how to appropriately respond to problems, and are much better at paper pushing than being leaders. At least George Bush admitted this. Katrina exposed serious problems in our response capability at all levels of government, and to the extent the federal government didn't fully do its job right, I take responsibility. Let's hope the federal government took that to heart.